I'm the youngest of 3 girls, so it was my dad, my mom, and just the 3 of us. We did stuff together. We would always be hanging out together, and sometimes that consisted of church on Sunday. Not very often, though. It turned into more on Christmas, on Easter, and maybe a couple other times sprinkled throughout the year. I knew it wasn't something they were against, but it was just something that didn't fit into our schedule. So that's when I started spending the night at my friends' houses on Saturdays, because I figured if I could do that, then it was too early for me to go back home in the morning, so I would get to go to church with them and I'd get to learn. I hate to say it like this, but I really didn't see it as without God, because God wasn't even in my framework. I thought of him, but I didn't think this is something that could be influencing my life. Things got really hard. I didn't have anything to look forward to. It was almost like everything was just on autopilot. It was almost to the point where I was just wishing when I woke up that I could go back to bed and I didn't have to be awake and I didn't have to face whatever was coming during the day. It was a Friday or a Saturday night, one of the two. I was working a night shift, so it was very busy. Obviously, when you're waiting tables, you have to put on a happy face, but it was a really hard day to try to keep that all in. I had this table. I've never met these people before. I had no idea who they were. They just started talking to me about how they're sisters and they're from a family of 4 girls. And out of nowhere, she looked at me and she just said that God has a plan for me. And we really weren't talking about faith. She just looked at me and said, God has a plan for you. She reached out and asked me if I wanted to go to church with her. And she told me about Westover, and so I went to church with her that Sunday. The next Sunday, I really wanted to come, so I sat in almost the exact seat that we were in. It's row H, seat 3, and I clung to that seat as if it was my life.
The morning I met Shannon, I walked in, and I don't do this every week, but that particular Sunday, I said, Lord, where do you want me to sit? And I remember it really clearly that I felt like the Lord wanted me to sit near her.
Pastor Don was at a part where he said, you're not always at the top of the mountain. You're gonna face struggles, and it's when you're at your lowest, that's when you need to hold on. And that's when you need to not give up, and you really need to look towards God instead of letting go. I started crying because here I am alone, and I didn't know why I was back. I just went out on a whim and I came out again, and here I am, and I'm hearing exactly what I needed to hear in that moment. That's God working.
We listened to the sermon together, and after the sermon, I knew that I needed to turn and talk to this young lady and get to know her.
You know when someone's looking at you and you can tell that someone wants to say something? Are you new here? That's how it started. I'm yep. How can you tell? Is it the nurse? Is it?
It seemed like we really connected on a couple different levels, personally, things that we had in common. So it seemed only natural to say, let's get together and have lunch or coffee sometime, and I'd like to get to know you better. So we did that. She told me about her life growing up, and we just shared from the heart, and we talked about Jesus. We chatted for quite a while.
Yeah.
And I got to know Shannon. In other churches, there had been these rules, and that you had never really heard the gospel like you did here, that it's not keeping the rules, but it's the relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
And that Jesus paid for our sins when we have broken the rules.
Yeah. Before it felt like a checklist of you have to do this, you have to do this.
Yeah.
And so it just was one more reason why I didn't fit in there. During one of the sermons, we were told to just look up at the cross. Just take a minute and look at the cross. And I remember sitting there and actually thinking a human being went through what Jesus went through on that. That's when it sunk in, I'm missing this whole part. I'm missing Jesus. I knew the whole story of how Jesus died for our sins, but really getting to know him and who he was as a person, learning all the great things that he did and how he lived that perfect life and then died for our sins when they were not his to bear. He didn't deserve any of that, but he did it for us. It was kind of that moment when I realized he did that for us so that we could be in relationship with God. That's when it all kind of was wow, that's amazing. Like, he did that for us so I can have a relationship with God.
So I was the person teaching the baptism class that Shannon first attended.
When I came to the baptism class, that was when I was actually able to voice, is it okay if I have doubts?
Shannon and I talked about the fact that doubts and questions they're really part of the normal Christian life. You looked pretty nervous when you came in the class.
I was very nervous.
Yeah, I could tell.
Trying to play it off.
You kind of hung around at the end, and you asked me a question. Do you remember what you asked me?
I asked you, is it okay to have doubts?
Yeah, and I think my response was, I hope so, because I have questions and doubts. That's part of the normal Christian life.
It was very comforting. And so I'm holding on to the hope that God really does have a good plan for me, because I know now I have that relationship with Jesus, and I have Jesus right by me, and I can lean on him, and I can depend on him. I'm his child, and I know that he loves me.